My son's missing mother knocked on my door after 12 years, Part 1. Opening the house fire took everything from that family except each other. I remember carrying the little girl out through the smoke, her arms locked around my neck so tight I could barely breathe, and I remember thinking, at least I got there in time. At least this one I saved. 12 years of nights like that. 12 years of running into other people's worst moments and walking out believing I was good at saving people. Just not the one person who mattered most. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the storm had turned the whole street into a blur of gray and headlights. I sat in the truck for a second longer than I needed to, the way I always did after a bad shift, letting the adrenaline drain out of me before I had to be a father again. Mason was upstairs. I could see the blue flicker of his lamp through the curtains. Homework? Probably. Or pretending to do homework. I was tired in a way that lived in my bones. The kind of tired 12 years builds in a man. I didn't hear the knock at first. The rain was too loud, hammering the porch roof, running in sheets off the gutter. Eric kept telling me he'd fix. Then it came again. Soft, almost polite. Like whoever it was didn't want to be a bother. I opened the door expecting a neighbor. A stranded driver. Anything ordinary. The porch light caught her face first. Wet hair plastered flat against a face I hadn't seen in 12 years. Too thin. Too pale. Eyes that had aged decades in a woman who should have still looked 30. For one full second, my mind refused to process what I was looking at, because the woman standing on my porch had been dead to me since the year Mason was born. Then she whispered it. 4 words, barely louder than the rain faprect. I finally found my way home. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Somewhere behind me, I heard Mason's footsteps stop at the top of the stairs, and I remember thinking, don't let this be a dream. And in the same breath, please let this be a dream. Because if it wasn't, if the woman standing in my doorway soaked to the bone was really her, then somebody had lied to me for 12 years. The door stayed open. The rain kept falling between us like it didn't know whether to let her in. And all I could think was, if she never died, where the hell had she been? Before we go any further, welcome. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us. And if you've been with us before, welcome back. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are right now. Drop it in the comments. I always read them, and it means a lot to know who's actually sitting on the other side of this story with me. We're always trying to bring you better dramas, stories that actually stay with you long after they end. So if there's a specific kind of story you want to see next, a theme, a topic, anything at all, tell us in the comments. We take those requests seriously, and we'll bring them to life. Now, let's get back to Daniel. For 12 years, grief has a strange way of becoming furniture. You stop noticing it's there. You just learn to walk around it. I built a life in the space where Natalie used to be. I learned how to braid nothing because I never had a daughter. But I learned how to be both parents to a son who used to ask why his mommy left without saying goodbye. I learned how to make pancakes on Saturday mornings because that used to be her thing, not mine. And somebody had to keep doing it so Mason wouldn't lose that too. I remember the first time I made them without her. Mason was maybe 4. He sat at the counter swinging his legs watching me flip a pancake wrong, and he said, "Mommy does it better." I told him I knew. I told him I was working on it. I didn't tell him that my hands were shaking because the last time I'd stood at that stove, she'd been standing right behind me with flour on her nose. That kitchen used to hold a different kind of memory. Before Mason. Before any of this. Natalie used to turn the radio up too loud on Sunday mornings, batter half mixed in the bowl, and pull me by the hand into the middle of the floor like the pancakes could wait. I was a terrible dancer. She never cared. She'd spin herself under my arm, laughing at nothing, flower handprints on my shirt, and tell me I was the only man alive who could make burning breakfast look romantic. "One day," she said once, resting her head against my chest while something on the stove definitely burned, "we're going to have a kid who thinks this is normal. Dancing in the kitchen, Dad ruining pancakes." I told her I hoped so. I didn't know yet how much I'd give to hear her laugh, like that one more time. That was the woman I married. Not the one standing in my doorway 12 years later, soaked to the bone, thin in a way that made my chest hurt to look at, whispering 4 words like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say them. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough for the rain to find its way past the porch and onto the hardwood. Long enough for my brain to finally catch up to my eyes. Natalie. Her name came out of me like something breaking. Behind me, the stairs creaked. Mason stood at the top in his socks, one hand on the railing, looking down at a woman he'd only ever seen in photographs I kept in a drawer I didn't open anymore. He was 13, old enough to understand what he was looking at. Too old to pretend he didn't feel something about it. Mason. Natalie's voice cracked around his name like it cost her everything she had left. You got so big. He didn't answer. He looked at her the way you look at a stranger who says they know you. Then he turned around and walked back to his room, and I heard the door close, not slam, just close, quiet and final, and somehow that quiet was worse than anything he could have shouted. Give him time, I said, mostly to myself. Natalie nodded like she understood, though I could see it cost her something to nod at all. I was still standing there, still trying to figure out whether I was supposed to hug her or call someone or wake up, when headlights swept across the living room window. A truck door slammed. Fast footsteps up the porch steps, and then Eric was standing in my doorway shaking rain off a bouquet of white lilies like he'd bought them on the drive over, which, knowing him, he probably had. Someone must have called him. Probably Mrs. Kowalski next door, the way news traveled on our street. Dan. He pulled me into a hug before I could say a word, the kind of hug that had gotten me through funerals and bad calls, and every anniversary I spent alone. Eric had been there for 12 years, built Mason's treehouse with his own hands. Sat in the hospital waiting room the night Mason broke his arm falling out of it. Called himself Mason's second dad, and never once made it feel like a lie. He pulled back, looked past me, and his whole face changed. Softened. Steadied. The kind of calm that made other people calm just by standing near it. Natalie. He said her name gently, held the lilies out like an offering, and smiled the warm, easy smile that had made him everybody's favorite person for as long as I'd known him. Welcome home. I expected her to cry. I expected relief, maybe disbelief, maybe even fear of the rest of us, strangers now, in a way, after 12 years. I didn't expect her to freeze, not flinch, freeze. Like something in her had simply stopped working. Her eyes dropped from his face to his wrist, to the watch he always wore, the one with his father's initials engraved on the back. The one I'd seen 1,000 times and never thought twice about. Something moved behind her eyes, recognition, or the ghost of it. Her mouth opened slightly, like a word was trying to climb out of her and couldn't find the strength. Then she said nothing at all. She just stood there in my doorway, rain still dripping from her hair onto floor. I'd mopped 100 times without her, staring at my best friend's wrist like she'd seen that exact watch somewhere she was still trying to forget. I didn't understand it. Not then. I just knew that for a woman who'd finally made it home, Natalie looked more afraid in that moment than she had the second she showed up soaking wet on my porch. And I couldn't stop asking myself the only question that made any sense. Why would she be terrified of the one man who'd never once let me down? Detective Lisa Grant showed up the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. I remembered her vaguely from 12 years ago, younger then, newer to the department, one of a dozen officers who'd cycled through our living room asking questions that never led anywhere. Cold case division now. Older, sharper around the eyes, the kind of tired that comes from carrying other people's unsolved lives for a living. She sat across from Natalie at our kitchen table with a legal pad and a recorder, and she started the way I imagined she'd started 100 times before. Gentle enough not to break something fragile. Take your time, she said. Whatever you remember, it doesn't have to make sense yet. I expected Natalie to cry. I expected fear, disjointed sentences, the kind of trauma you see in movies. Instead, she folded her hands on the table like she was back in her old classroom. And she talked like a woman reciting something she'd rehearsed 10,000 times in the dark. The building always smelled like fresh lumber, she said. Sawdust. Like a construction site that never finished building anything. I used to think if I ever got out, I'd never be able to walk into a hardware store again. Lisa wrote without looking up. Any idea what kind of building? Warehouse, workshop, warehouse, Natalie said, immediate, certain. High ceiling, metal beams, I counted them once. 14. Going one direction. I sat there watching my wife describe a prison I couldn't picture, and I realized I'd spent 12 years imagining her final moments. A struggle, a scream, something quick and terrible I could at least grieve cleanly. Not this. Not years. Not counting beams on a ceiling just to stay sane. There was a train, Natalie continued, every night. Almost exactly 11 o'clock. Close enough that I used it like a clock. I'd hear it coming from a distance. This low sound in the walls before you could even hear the whistle. And then it would pass, and I'd know another day was over. Freight train, Lisa said, mostly to herself, already writing. Time specific. That's workable. That's a route we can actually check. Natalie nodded, then went quiet for a second, her hands tightening slightly on the table. There was a man who came sometimes, not the ones who kept me there day to day. Someone above them. I never saw all of his face. But he had this habit. Her voice thinned out, careful, like she was walking across ice. A lighter, silver. Engraved, I think, though I never got close enough to read it. He'd flip it open and closed when he was thinking. Open, closed. Open, closed. Like he didn't even know he was doing it. The room went very still. Did he ever speak to you directly? Lisa asked. Careful now, too, the way you get careful when a witness is close to something. Anything you remember him actually saying? Natalie's eyes moved to the window, to the rain still streaking the glass from the night before, and for a moment I didn't think she was going to answer at all. Not often, she said, but when he did, his voice was gentle. That was the worst part of it. Kind enough that some nights I told myself maybe he was trying to help before I hated myself for even thinking it. She wrapped her arms around herself like the memory itself was cold. He had this way of saying it's going to be all right. Like he actually believed it. Like it cost him something to say it. I used to lie there hating how much I wanted to believe him too. The kitchen didn't move. I didn't move. Somewhere in my chest something cold dropped and kept falling, though I couldn't have told you why. There was no name attached to it, nothing solid to point at, just the strange, unplaceable dread of a stranger's kindness described by my wife like it was a wound. I told myself it meant nothing. Kidnappers weren't supposed to be kind. Maybe she'd misheard something, misremembered, built comfort out of nothing the way the mind does when it's desperate for any small mercy in 12 years of none. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just felt it, hard and fast, the way you feel a door slam somewhere else in the house. Lisa didn't react the way I did. She wrote without looking up, and when she finally raised her head, her stillness had the particular quality of someone who'd learned a long time ago not to show her hand too early. That's good, she said. That's actually very good, Natalie. A location detail, a time-specific pattern, a physical object with an engraving, and now something as specific as tone of voice, a phrase he repeated. That's more than most cold cases get in a decade. You believe her? I heard myself ask, and I hated how much it sounded like a question I needed answered for myself. I believe every one of these details can be checked, Lisa said carefully. Freight schedules are public record. Warehouse zoning is public record. If any of this is real, it'll show up somewhere on paper. That's not belief, Mr. Real. It'll show up somewhere on paper. Brooks, that's just investigation. From the doorway, Mason's voice cut in flat and hard in a way that didn't sound like a 13-year-old. Or she's making it up. Nobody had heard him come down. He stood there in his school clothes, backpack already on his shoulder, staring at Natalie like she was a stranger telling a story he'd decided not to buy tickets for. Mason. I started. A lighter, a train, and a voice, he said. That's it? That's supposed to prove she didn't just leave us? His voice cracked on the last word, and underneath the anger I heard exactly what it was covering. 12 years of being told in 100 quiet ways that his mother chose to disappear. I'm going to school. The door shut behind him, softer than his words had been. Natalie stared at the space where he'd stood, and I watched something in her face fold in on itself. Grief stacked on top of grief. Lisa clicked her recorder off and gathered her legal pad, and at the door she paused, glancing back at Natalie with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'll pull the freight records and warehouse zoning today, she said. Quietly. It's a start. After she left, I stood in my kitchen a long time, the same kitchen where Natalie used to dance in flour and burnt pancake smoke, and I told myself the same thing I kept telling myself since the words left her mouth. It's just a voice. A lot of men sound gentle. It doesn't mean anything. But some small, cowardly part of me had already started running through every voice I knew. Every man who'd ever stood in my kitchen called me on a bad night, told me it's going to be all right when I needed to hear it most. Searching, without wanting to, for anything that didn't fit. And underneath all of it, one question kept circling back, no matter how hard I tried to drown it out. If I heard that voice directed at someone else, would I even recognize it as the same one? 3 days later, Lisa came back with a name I never expected to hear. Victor's. Your brother-in-law, she said, sliding into the same kitchen chair she'd sat in the morning Natalie gave her statement. I have to ask about him. I know that's not easy to hear. It wasn't. Victor had always been Natalie's older brother first, family second, the kind of man who loved hard and struggled harder. Marine Corps, 2 tours, home with a temper he never fully learned to put down. He'd been in and out of work for years, a bar fight that put a man in a hospital and put Victor in a holding cell for a weekend. Money trouble that never quite let up. And 12 years ago, on the day Natalie disappeared, nobody could account for 4 hours of his afternoon. I hadn't thought about that in years. I'd buried it, the same way I'd buried everything from that time I couldn't survive looking at directly. But Lisa laid it out flat on my kitchen table. The debts, the record, the gap in his story, and I felt something in me tilt sideways. He was broke, Lisa said. He needed money. People do terrible things for less. He's family, I said. But even as I said it, I heard how thin it sounded. Because the truth was, in 12 years, some small, ugly part of me had always wondered. Victor had shown up angry to our wedding rehearsal dinner over some ancient argument with Natalie I never fully understood. He'd missed Mason's second birthday completely. No call, no explanation. He loved fiercely and disappeared just as fiercely, and grief makes you suspicious of anyone who doesn't grieve the way you expect them to. Lisa pulled him in for questioning. I sat in the hallway outside the interview room for 2 hours, staring at a vending machine, rehearsing what I'd say to Natalie if it turned out to be true. If the man who'd walked her down the aisle at our wedding had been the reason she was gone for 12 years, I thought about Mason's treehouse, about every Thanksgiving Victor skipped, about the desperate look he used to get whenever money came up at family dinners. By the time Lisa came out, I'd already convinced myself. He has an alibi, she said. The words didn't land right away. What? A verified one? Security footage from a pharmacy 2 towns over time-stamped the exact afternoon Natalie disappeared. He was picking up medication for their mother. Chemo side effects, nausea meds. He never told anyone because he didn't want people knowing she was sick again. Didn't want the pity. Lisa rubbed her eyes. It's airtight, Daniel. He's not our guy. I sat down hard in the plastic chair across from her. Relief came first, sharp and immediate, because some part of me had been dreading having to look Natalie in the eye and tell her that her own brother had done this to her. But right behind the relief came something heavier. We were back to nothing. 12 years, and the only lead we'd had collapsed in a pharmacy security tape. So we start over, I said. We start over, Lisa agreed, and for the first time since she'd taken the case, she looked tired in a way that wasn't just professional. I drove home that night feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under a house I'd only just started rebuilding. Natalie was waiting at the kitchen table when I walked in, and I didn't have to say anything. She read it on my face. It wasn't him, I said. Victor. He's clear. Something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly. Grief and relief tangled together the way they always seem to be in our house now. I never thought it was him, she said quietly. I just couldn't say why. I didn't have anything to give you instead. We sat in silence for a while. Rain again, softer this time, tapping the window instead of hammering it. Then Natalie's eyes went somewhere far away, the way they did when a memory was surfacing slow, like something rising through deep water. There's one thing, she said. I don't know if it matters. Tell me. The train, she said. Every night, 11 o'clock, like I told Lisa. But Sundays were different. Her fingers pressed flat against the table, like she was steadying herself against the memory. On Sundays, it didn't just pass, it stopped, completely, sometimes for almost an hour. I used to hear the brakes, this long metal shriek, and then nothing. Just silence where the train should have been. I didn't understand why that mattered. But when I called Lisa and repeated it word for word, I heard her go quiet on the other end of the line. The particular quiet of someone doing math in their head. Freight trains don't just stop for an hour, she said slowly. Not on a live route. Unless they're switching yards. Loading, unloading, waiting on clearance. I heard papers shuffling, keys clicking. There's exactly one industrial rail yard in this county that runs a Sunday morning hold pattern like that. It services maybe 6 warehouses total. 6 warehouses, I repeated. 6 warehouses I can now legally request records for, Lisa said, and for the first time in 12 years, I heard something in a detective's voice that sounded almost like hope. Daniel, this is the first real thread we've had. Give me a few days. I hung up the phone and looked at Natalie, sitting at our kitchen table with her hands still pressed flat against the wood like she was holding herself together by touch alone. 12 years of nothing. And then, out of a stopped train on a Sunday morning, we finally had somewhere to look. I found her in the doorway of Mason's old room, the one at the end of the hall we didn't use anymore. Not the room he slept in now. That was down the hall. Banned posters and dirty laundry and the ordinary chaos of a 13-year-old. This was the room I'd never had the heart to empty. The nursery, once. Then a toddler's room. I'd stopped adding to it around the time Mason turned 6, and somehow I'd never gotten around to taking it apart either. I don't know how long Natalie stood there before I noticed her. She wasn't crying yet. She was just looking. The way you look at something you're afraid will disappear if you move too fast. The crib, we'd never had the heart to sell. A stack of birthday presents against the wall, still wrapped, some of them yellowed at the corners. One for every year I couldn't bring myself to either give away or open, because giving them away felt like giving up, and opening them felt like admitting she was never coming back. She knelt slowly and picked up the smallest one, turned it over in her hands. Then she saw the drawings. Eleanor, my mother, had kept every single one Mason ever made in preschool, stick figures, a family of 3 that eventually became 4 with an empty space where the 4th should have been, a son with a face, a house with too many windows. Natalie went through them one by one, her hands shaking, and when she got to a drawing of 3 people holding hands under a sun, one labeled Dad, one labeled M.E., and a third one, smaller, with no label at all, just a girl with long hair and question marks where a face should be. That's when she broke. No words. I stood in the doorway and I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. And some things don't need witnesses. They just need someone to stay in the room. She held the baby blanket, the one from the hospital, the one with his birth weight still stitched into the corner, against her chest, and she cried the kind of crying that doesn't make sound, just shakes. I sat down on the floor next to her, not touching, just there. I used to imagine this room, she said, finally, so quiet I almost missed it. In the dark, I used to build it in my head, piece by piece, so I wouldn't forget what it looked like. I got the crib wrong. I always pictured it white. It's not white. We repainted it, I said, year 3. I don't even remember why. She nodded like that made sense, like 12 years could be measured in a paint color she'd never known about. I don't know what made me say it. Maybe it was the room. Maybe it was her, small and folded in on herself on the floor of a nursery we both mourned in different ways. I spent 12 years believing I failed you, I said. She looked up at me. I keep thinking if I'd picked you up from the store that day, instead of letting you go alone, none of this happens. I've run it 1,000 different ways in my head. 1,000 versions where I get there 30 seconds sooner and you're standing in the parking lot annoyed I'm late and we go home and nothing ever happens to you. I was a firefighter for 12 years. I ran into burning buildings and pulled strangers out, and I couldn't save the one person, Daniel. Her voice cut through mine, steadier than I expected. You didn't fail me. I keep telling myself that. I don't believe it." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had an edge I hadn't heard from her since she'd come home. "There were nights I hated you for it," she said. "I know that's not fair. I know you didn't choose any of this. But lying there in the dark, some nights I told myself if you really loved me the way I thought you did, you'd have found me by now. I hated myself more for thinking it than I ever hated you. But I did think it. I need you to know that too, not just the parts that are easy to hear." I didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of "I'm sorry" that fit what she'd just handed me. "But that wasn't fair," she said, softer now. "You raised our son." She reached for my hand and her fingers were cold, still shaking slightly. "You kept every drawing, you painted his room and kept the crib, and you never once let him forget I existed, even when it would have been easier to. That's not failure. That's the opposite of failure. Somebody took me from you. You didn't let me go. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it because I spent 12 years surviving on the hope that you hadn't given up on me, and you didn't. You never did." I put my head down and, for the first time in 12 years, I let myself cry in front of her without trying to stop it. I don't know how long we sat there on that nursery floor before either of us moved again. At some point I thought, unbidden, about the summer Eric spent 3 straight weekends in our driveway teaching Mason to ride a bike without training wheels, one hand on the seat, jogging alongside him down the block, laughing every time Mason wobbled and caught himself before he fell. I thought about how certain I'd been, watching that I was the luckiest man alive to have a friend who showed up like that for my son. I had no idea, sitting in that nursery with Natalie's tears drying on my shirt, how soon that memory would turn into something I couldn't look at directly anymore. Across town in an office he thought no one would ever see inside, Eric Collins fed papers into a shredder one folder at a time. He worked carefully, methodically, the way he did everything. Old contracts, old invoices, a ledger with 2 sets of numbers that had never been meant to see daylight, one for the municipal auditors, one for himself. He'd been doing this for years, quietly, patiently, the way a man erases something he's convinced himself no one is looking for anymore. He didn't know that 3 days earlier, Detective Lisa Grant had pulled financial records from 6 warehouses serviced by a rail yard with a very particular Sunday morning schedule. He didn't know that one of those 6 warehouses had a lease traced back through 2 shell companies to a name that made Lisa sit very still at her desk for a long time before she picked up her phone. He didn't know that payments, small ones, disguised as maintenance fees, spread out over 12 years so no single transaction would ever raise a flag, had left a trail exactly where trails always end up. On paper, in banks, in places men like Eric believed themselves too careful to be caught. By the time the last folder went through the shredder, it no longer mattered. Lisa was already on the phone with a judge. I didn't know any of that yet. I was still on the floor of a nursery that used to be white, holding my wife's hand, believing, for one quiet hour, that the worst of it might finally be behind us. I had no idea we were still standing at the edge of it. The next morning, Lisa called before I'd even had coffee. "We got the warrant," she said. "We're moving on the warehouse tonight. Part 2 picks up right here. The raid, the truth behind the lighter, and the confrontation none of us saw coming. See you there."